The last guest lecture is titled War Heroes Became Deserters and War Whores Turned into Singing Babushkas, Displaced Persons and Gender in Cold War Belgium, and it is given by Professor Dr. Machteld Venken. In the aftermath of the Second World War, many displaced persons moved to Belgium, among others soldiers who had fought in a Polish armoured division with the Allied forces and former female forced labourers from the Soviet Union. These immigrant men and women married Belgian citizens. The presentation describes how Machteld Venken researched and compared the migrants' attempts to give meaning to their war experiences and post-war life, as well as the various processes they used to understand and articulate what they had been through. As the author found out, these processes were shaped not only by the characteristics of the war experiences themselves, but also by the changing positions these migrants held within their home and host societies. Adopting the perspective of these newcomers to Belgium, this transnational comparative study examines how they gathered in groups in order to remember their war experiences and how they were integrated into and/or excluded from their home and host societies over time. Machteld Venken is a professor of contemporary transnational history at the Luxembourg Center for Contemporary and Digital History. She studied Slavic languages and cultures, European studies and history in Belgium, Poland and Ukraine. Venken earned her PhD in 2008 at the Leuven University in Belgium and her accreditation to supervise research in 2018 at the University of Vienna in Austria. She has been a principal investigator of 8 funded research projects in 4 European countries. Venken joined the University of Luxembourg in 2019 after a visiting scholarship at the Immigrant in Jena in Germany and an Attract Brains for Brussels fellowship at the Vrije University Brussels in Belgium. Her main research interests are transnational, transregional, and comparative histories of Europe, migration, borderlands, oral history, the history of families and children, and citizen science.
War heroes became deserters and war whores turned into singing babushkas, displaced persons in Cold War Belgium. Today, I will tell you the story of how I did the research for my first book, titled Straddling the Iron Curtain, Immigrants, Immigrant Organizations, War Memories. The results of my study can be found in the book, which can be downloaded for free from the website of my institution as well as from my personal website. I started to work on my PhD in January 2005 at the Catholic University of Leuven. I was to research the political history of Polish and Ukrainian migrants in Belgium during the Cold War era. Because many archival sources in Central and Eastern Europe, formerly off limits, had been opened up, I soon afterwards headed for Poland. There, I looked into the way Polish secret services followed the activities of migrants in Belgium. I witnessed how one of the most important schisms in the Polish historiographical landscape came about, between those historians fascinated by the institutional structure of repression and the biographies of its actors and victims, and those who are convinced such findings need to be embedded in a broader context. In the files, I found an agent who had tried to convince migrant men who had fought as soldiers during the Second World War and later settled in Belgium to move back to Poland. The man was sent out during the Korean War because Polish authorities were afraid migrant ex-combatants living in Belgium would join the American army and go to fight in Korea. This was highly unrealistic because the ex-combatants had already married Belgian citizens and had often founded families. Not a single one of them felt attracted either to fight in Korea or to move back to Poland. I am grateful the historian Marcinkula warned me not to get trapped in the sensation over the Secret Service's archives. I indeed found more relevant materials in other Polish archives, such as the files of a Polish institution set up in the 1950s to get into contact with migrants. Instead of centralizing the aims of organizations mobilizing migrants from abroad, I now investigated the aims of the migrants writing to that institution. I found out that their reasons were more often social than political. I felt a need to venture beyond the political focus of my project. I was showing my supervising committee an article in which the author argued research on migrants tends to overrepresent their political engagement because researchers prefer to attend embassy gatherings instead of local fairs. Luckily, they agreed. The new approach enabled me to investigate what I had left untouched before. An overview text of the subject of Ukrainian migration in Belgium highlighted the political engagement of about 2,500 mostly male migrants, while leaving out the experiences of about 1,500 women married to Belgians. Why did the author, an old migrant himself, write the women out of his text? I asked myself. The author gave me the contact details to one of these women. Talking to her, I discovered that what he had labeled as Ukrainian women were women belonging to a migration stream of Soviet young women of Ukrainian, Russian, or Belarusian descent who, after the German invasion of the Soviet Union on the 22nd June of 1941, were deported to Germany to do forced labor. After their liberation by the Western Allies, these Ostarbeiterinnen, as they were called at the time, chose to marry the Belgian boyfriends they had met at work, and these were deported workers, volunteers, or prisoners of war, rather than be repatriated to the Soviet Union, where they could be accused of collaboration. The Ostarbeiterinnen settled in their husbands' hometowns or villages. While living in Belgium, the former Ostarbeiterinnen experienced negative stereotyping as war whores or communists. That is why the author had left them out of his text. Inspired by the migration historian Marloes Grover, who was running a research project comparing migrant women with migrant men in the Netherlands, I decided to compare these former Ostarbeiterinnen with about 350 soldiers from Poland who had liberated the northern part of Belgium, Flanders, in 1944, had met Flemish young women during their liberation march, and had later settled in their wives' hometowns. Marloes' advice helped me to analyze the way Belgian migration politics had looked like for these migrants. I searched for them in old marriage registers, the records of the Belgian aliens police, naturalization files, and in church and archives of immigrant organizations. In the archival sources the ex-soldiers had produced, I could count how many hours they had spent together on commemoration services about the liberation of Belgium, but not why that had been important to them. The sources also did not reveal anything about the family lives of the ex-soldiers. I then decided to search for the former Ostarbeiterinnen and former soldiers and interviewed them. During the interviews, I for the first time became aware of the gendered role I was playing as an academic. The migrant men were proud that a researcher from the university, as they formulated it, had come all the way up to their home to conduct an interview. They did not hesitate to tell neighbors that they did not have time to spend with them because they were busy with history. My knowledge of Polish was sufficient to establish a relationship between us. However, some interviewees could not help making sexual allusions towards a girl who was up to 60 years younger than them. My presence also hindered them from articulating how they felt about their popularity in 1944. Since most of the former Ostarbeiterinnen were housewives, they were less visible for me and therefore more difficult to find. Even when I managed to be invited for an interview, these migrant women often harbored suspicion, were reluctant to speak, and unwilling to refer me to a friend for a further interview. I felt the interview setting was not going to give me a close insight into the lives of the migrant women. When I got in touch with a member of their organization, the Association for Soviet Citizens in Antwerp, she introduced me to their weekly gatherings. That is how I came up with the idea to observe the women while attending their meetings. The women looked visibly afraid during our first encounter. I introduced myself as Machteld, with my first name, because I guessed words like university or research would put them off. Machteld did not fit into the setting of their gatherings, which were mostly held in Russian and Ukrainian, and so they called me Masha. I saw the old women were chatting about the weather over a cup of tea and singing songs like the popular folklore song Katyusha. I realized they sang the same songs every week. I felt I needed to participate in their meetings until they would show me why they did that. I had the feeling I was on the right path when they started to call me our Masha a couple of meetings later, but I had not found out yet why they were gathering, talking, and singing. Around that moment, I held a project presentation for my colleagues at the university. I proudly told my audience that I was observing their gatherings, that I was trying to understand them, but that they, so far, had kept silent about the past. The harshest reaction sounded like, Miss Venken, historiography is a scientific discipline dealing with the past. Historians base their conclusions on empirical facts. Observing silence in the present does not seem to get you where you need to be at the end of your PhD studies. I encourage you to reconsider your research topic and approach." End quote. About half of the audience joined that historian in his analysis and made suggestions ranging from leaving out the migrant women from my study to refocusing on migration policy. But there were also other reactions. Why not return to interviewing? Maybe I could ask additional questions. And why not search in Russian archives which contacts the migrant women had had with people in the Soviet Union? I could not trace those archives back. I was a young PhD student experimenting with methodologies as they seemed useful to me, not yet fully aware of what was and wasn't common in the historiographical discipline. And then there was a lucky strike. At one point, the Russian Cultural Institute in Brussels scheduled a presentation of a representative of the Motherland Association, which in the Soviet Union had contacts with what it called countrymen living abroad. Its successor had stood up and resumed work. At the presentation, I received the representative's permission to see the Motherland Association's archives in Moscow. The files had not been deposited in an official archive, but were stored in the director's office. I was given a working spot in the room of his secretary and was allowed to read what he selected for me. The director believed, or wanted to believe, I was supporting the reappreciation of the Soviet past within the Russian Federation started under Vladimir Putin. The Soviet Union is increasingly remembered as a time of stability and cohesion, a time in which one took care of countrymen living abroad. Instead of glorifying its past activities, however, I wanted to see what the association had meant for the migrant women. But I could not say that aloud. So I said things such as, the documents seem to show employees liked their jobs. The more I did this, the more materials I received on my desk. This is how I came to know, for example, that the Motherland Association in Moscow invited choir directors of the Association for Soviet Citizens Living in Belgium to the Soviet Union. Most choir directors in Belgium had received courses in Soviet propaganda songs for free. The Motherland Association archives provided me with the empirical facts. I now realized that by changing my first name, the migrant women had already given me an indication. More than half a century after they had moved, they remained influenced by what happened in their home societies. During their gatherings in Belgium, they sang the songs the choir conductors had learned on courses in the Soviet Union. You see the same mechanism here as among the migrant men who had written letters to an organization in Poland. One cannot research the integration process of migrants in Belgian society by staying in Belgium and looking at the traces the migrants left there. Even during the Cold War era, the history of these migrants was a transnational one. Immigrants' war memories were constructed and performed in constant negotiation with what I came to call agencies of war memory articulation on both sides of the former Iron Curtain. With regards to the Ostarbeiterinnen. The close cooperation between the Soviet consulate, the Motherland Organization in Moscow, and the Association for Soviet Citizens in Belgium, this created a situation in which the formation of a democratic organizational landscape, as well as the construction of an own group narrative on war memory, seemed to have been nipped in the bud. Most often, the narrative which members articulated in the public sphere aligned with the official Soviet narrative on war memory. With regards to the ex-combatants, transnational agencies in Great Britain and the Polish People's Republic offered them the opportunity and finances to establish formal immigrant organizations in Belgium and tried to push through their narratives on war memory. Agencies from Great Britain were the most successful and stimulated the group gathering of former division soldiers, whereas the other, less numerous, former Allied soldiers from Poland who were left aside eagerly received support from agencies of the Polish People's Republic. Mutual hatred between the two camps developed over the years. Interestingly, Belgian-dominant agencies articulating war memory only became aware of the exclusiveness of former Allied soldiers from Poland thanks to the support these former soldiers enjoyed from abroad. I continued my research in the Lenin Library in Moscow. I wanted to find out whether the former Ostarbeiterinnen who had returned to the Soviet Union had also sung. In the early 1950s, Soviet ethnomusicologists had revealed that during the Second World War, these Ostarbeiterinnen had composed alternative lyrics to the Soviet propaganda songs they had learned before the war in order to articulate what they were going through and to commemorate their dead colleagues. However, once the war was over, they mostly stopped singing these alternative lyrics. I now needed to find out what had happened with the former Ostarbeiterinnen who migrated to Belgium. The grandson of the choir conductor in Antwerp mentioned his grandmother had recently told him she still remembered the alternative lyrics she had sung during the Second World War to the melodies of some songs that had been part of the choir's repertoire for years. I was invited to her house, and she sang songs in both their original and alternative wordings. The songs are in Russian. You can find the translation on this slide. We will now listen to the alternative wordings.
Смело мы в бой пойдем за суп с картошкой, фашиста разобьем столовой ложкой.
I realized something had changed when, at a rehearsal I attended, that choir conductor spontaneously followed the choir's rendition of the popular folk song Katyusha with and we, after which she started to sing the alternative war version, glorifying Katyusha. This is the first rocket launcher produced on a mass scale in the Soviet Union and used by the Red Army against the German army. One of the phrases of the alternative lyrics goes, "We love to hear how she sings." To cut a long story short, the former Ostarbeiterinnen in Belgium had organized themselves in the Association for Soviet Citizens because Soviet diplomats had made sure that only members could receive a visa to visit their family members. But the practices of the members were different from what Soviet diplomats wanted them to do. Междустрочность, the Russian word for the art of reading between the lines, had not only been a social practice in the Soviet Union, but also among these migrant women. They had formed a community of remembrance. They had continued to sing the original propaganda songs with their choirs, in this way silencing but not forgetting the accompanying second layer of meaning. Through painstaking repetition, the singing took on a ritualized character, making the unutterable utterable. The migrant women gave me hints to what they had experienced during the Second World War, sometimes through talking, but more often through whispering, quarreling, or singing. Only with these hints in mind could I come to a meaningful interpretation of their written sources. My ambition became not to fill in their silenced memory, but to present it as silenced, and to concentrate on the practices they had developed in order to articulate that silence. These migrant men and women were ostensibly doing the same thing, commemorating their colleagues who had died during the Second World War and remembering their own war experiences. But they were making their utterances in completely different spaces and in very different ways. I paid attention to the power and time dynamics that led migrants to articulate their memories in the public or private sphere. I needed a mix of different methodologies in order to come to that conclusion. Before, historians had mainly focused on how people articulated themselves in one space, either at public commemoration services, often before monuments, or in oral testimonies. In the cultural field on war memory, various agencies or voices articulate their narratives on war memory. Agencies find their way to various arenas, spaces so to speak, of war memory articulation. In these arenas, both dominant and dominated agencies compete with each other and determine both which war experiences are remembered and which ones are silenced, as well as what shape the articulated and silenced narratives on war memory take. I asked when and under which circumstances the people from the two migration streams formed immigrant organizations uttering collective narratives on war memory, and to what extent these narratives became integrated in the cultural field on war memory of their host and home societies. The bottom-up approach brings to light which power dynamics influenced the war memories of the people I studied. It examines the interplay of dominant agencies of war memory articulation, mechanisms of marginalization, mobilization or support, and the characteristics of war experiences themselves, to display how they led the war memories of the newcomers to articulating or silencing their memories in various arenas. It turns out that only the war memories of former Allied soldiers from Poland found their way to commemoration services. In addition, spaces one would never have imagined appear to have functioned as arenas of war memory articulation. Here, I refer, for instance, to a podium set up for the proliferation of Soviet propaganda songs. And here comes my third finding: ethnic categorization from above. It is calling the people I researched Polish men and Russian or Ukrainian women is widespread in migration research. And if empirical evidence exists for such a categorization, it usually goes unquestioned. The collapse of communism turned political divisions within society into ethnified ones. Former Allied soldiers from Poland only recently became ethnified by fellow immigrants, and former Ostarbeiterinnen only recently made the switch to ethnic transnationals. It had been convenient for the migrant men that the war activities of their army unit were interpreted through the eyes of the ongoing Cold War. History had simply started with Catholic Poles liberating Belgium, and it was the installation of the Communist Polish People's Republic that had forced these men to stay in exile. Presenting themselves in this way facilitated their integration within their Catholic Flemish villages. When growing older, however, the migrant men wanted to safeguard their military legacy, and the Belgian ex-combatant organization they wanted to merge with considered their anti-communist feelings no longer of relevance. Instead, it foregrounded an element of the Polish army unit's character that had remained untouched before: its recruitment. The army unit had also consisted of people who had voluntarily or forcibly been enrolled in the German army and had deserted. Members of the Belgian ex-combatant organization did not want to include former soldiers with a past in the German army in their circles and demanded the curriculum vitae of every single migrant man be checked. The discussion this provoked stirred up so much emotion that the migrant men suddenly could not find a common language any longer. In the end, the old man decided to merge with an organization gathering newer migrants from Poland instead, hoping to find more understanding for their past here while presenting themselves as fellow ethnics. You see something similar in the case of the former Ostarbeiterinnen. They lost Soviet citizenship and opted for Belgian citizenship when they were offered the choice between a Belgian or a Russian/Ukrainian/Belarusian passport in the early 1990s. But they did not dissolve their organization, the Association for Soviet Citizens. In 2007, indeed, there was still an Association for Soviet Citizens in Belgium. At one of its concerts, however, the grandson of the former choir conductor presented the choir to the public as consisting of Russian and Ukrainian women. By accompanying the songs with Roma folk melodies, in addition, that grandson led the choir to its biggest success ever. We're now going to listen to a fragment. Nobody, even the few Russian speakers in the public, cared about the contents of the song. They hardly seemed to react to words like Comrade Voroshilov, referring to the army officer and later intimate friend of Stalin Kliment Yefremovich Voroshilov. Instead, the public embraced what they called charming vodka-drinking babushkas and exoticized them as our Buena Vista Social Club. Choir members were using the same technique here as during the Cold War. They added an additional layer of meaning to the lyrics of folklore songs, songs about the Russian Revolution, or Soviet propaganda songs. This time it facilitated their acceptance as ethnic transnationals.
At the end of my presentation, I want to tell you how the migrants and their war experiences are remembered today. The ex-combatants are included in a newly constructed concept, the Poles who fought in the West for the liberation of the Polish fatherland. By now, every liberated municipality in Belgium has at least a street name, commemoration placard, or monument remembering the contribution of the 1st Polish Armoured Division to the liberation of the country. The ex-combatants are visible in the public sphere, and their legacy is supported by important players with decision-making power. In 2019, the exhibition Armoured Wings, on the occasion of the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Belgium, was established on the initiative of the Flemish government, the Polish embassy in Belgium, and the non-profit organization Eerste Poolse Panzerdivisie België. It is no longer possible to count the books published about the Polish contribution to the liberation of Belgium on two hands. The most recent one is titled Forgotten Heroes, Vergeten Helden, and falsely creates the impression that the immigrant men were forgotten. They never were. Already in 1946, the City Council of St. Nicholas granted the men honorary citizenship. Now that the men have died, also their bodily memory has been transferred to the next generations. One grandson, for example, decided to place a tattoo taking the form of the war scar of his grandfather, in this way non-verbally remembering what he had been through. For the Ostarbeiterinnen, visibility came only at the beginning of the 21st century, with the German and Austrian initiative to pay the women a war pension for their work during the war. There is very good international research available, including oral histories of former Ostarbeiterinnen who returned to the Soviet Union after the end of the war. In order to stress that also Ostarbeiterinnen ended up on the other side of what became the Iron Curtain, I have published my research in English, German, and Dutch, but also in Ukrainian. But it was waiting until 2021 before the former Ostarbeiterinnen gained visibility in Belgium. An exhibition in the Red Star Line Museum in Antwerp titled Destination Sweetheart frames the story of one Ostarbeiterin who moved to Belgium in the post-war as a love story. Although I welcome this initiative, this depiction is gendered. The Polish ex-combatants were as dependent on their wives in order to be able to stay in Belgium as the former Ostarbeiterinnen. But this seems a story one is not yet ready to tell. Thank you for your attention.